The quiet stillness of the night in Tecumseh, Michigan, was undisturbed, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of passing cars. The small town, tucked away in Lenawee County, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where porch lights flickered lazily over manicured lawns, and where the air carried the faint scent of damp earth after an early autumn rain. It was a place of routine, of familiarity, but that night something shifted, something unseen yet undeniable. At precisely 8:41 p.m., a call shattered the routine stillness of the Lenawee County 911 dispatch center. The sharp ring cut through the low murmur of voices, instantly commanding attention. Dispatcher Rachel Carter, a seasoned professional with over a decade of experience, reached for her headset. The glow of her computer screen illuminated her face as she clicked to accept the call. Her voice was even, measured, the kind of voice trained to anchor people in moments of panic. 911. What's your emergency? For a moment, only the sound of heavy breathing came through the line. Frantic, uneven, bordering on hyperventilation. Then a man's voice, raw with emotion, broke through. Oh God, my wife. She's dead. I think she hanged herself. Rachel immediately straightened, her fingers poised over the keyboard. She had handled distress calls before, domestic disputes, medical emergencies, even violent incidents. But there was something in this man's voice that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't just fear, it was something else, something harder to define. Sir, I need you to take a deep breath. Tell me your location. There was a rustling sound, like fabric against wood. Then, in a choked gasp, the man replied, 2435 Maple Street. Please, you have to hurry, Rachel typed rapidly, relaying the address to the responding officers. She glanced at the screen, confirming that units were already en route. All right, help is on the way, but I need you to stay with me. Is she breathing? A pause, just a beat too long. Then came the sound of shuffling, footsteps against hardwood, and something that almost resembled the faintest metallic scrape. Rachel's grip on her headset tightened. I don't know. I tried, but she's not moving. She's cold. His voice cracked, dissolving into unintelligible sobs. Rachel remained calm, her training kicking in. Sir, I need you to check for a pulse. Lay her on a flat surface if you haven't already. Can you do that for me? I already did. I tried everything. His voice grew desperate. She's gone. She's just gone. Rachel's screen blinked, confirmation that emergency units were less than 2 minutes away. She forced her voice to remain steady. I understand this is difficult, but I need you to stay with me. How did you find her? Another pause, this one longer, more deliberate. I came downstairs and she was just there, hanging. The dispatcher's fingers hovered over the keyboard, noting his words carefully. She had taken enough calls in her career to recognize the difference between panic and performance. And something about this call didn't feel right. Outside, the night carried on as usual. TVs flickering through curtained windows, families settling into their evening routines, unaware that at 2435 Maple Street, something had gone terribly wrong. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness as the first patrol car pulled up in front of 2435 Maple Street. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest single-story home with a sloping roof and a narrow driveway. A dim porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the front lawn, where an aging oak tree swayed in the crisp autumn breeze. It was the kind of house that blended into the fabric of a quiet town, where neighbors exchanged polite nods and life followed a predictable rhythm. But something about it felt still, too still. Officer Daniel Mercer was the first to step out of his cruiser, his boots crunching against the gravel as he made his way toward the front door. His partner, Officer Jenna Collins, followed close behind, her hand resting instinctively on the grip of her flashlight. They had responded to plenty of distress calls before, some false alarms, others routine medical emergencies. But the tone of the dispatch had been different this time. Something about the way the man on the phone had spoken, the pauses, the uneven breaths. It unsettled them both. Mercer reached the front steps and knocked firmly. No response. He exchanged a glance with Collins before knocking again, harder this time. The door creaked open slightly under the force, revealing a sliver of the dimly lit hallway beyond. The faint scent of something stale hung in the air, like dust, like old fabric left too long in a closed-up space. From deeper inside the house, footsteps echoed against the wooden floors. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. James Jimmy Allan. He stood in the entryway, disheveled, his hands trembling at his sides. His face was pale, eyes wide with something that resembled shock. He wasn't crying, not in the way one might expect from a man who had just lost his wife. Instead, his expression was hollow, as if the enormity of what had happened hadn't fully settled in yet. "Are you the one who called?" Mercer asked, his voice steady, professional. Jimmy nodded, his throat working as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. He stepped back, motioning toward the hallway that led deeper into the house. She's downstairs," he finally whispered. Mercer gestured for Collins to follow as they stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of a television somewhere in the background. The walls were lined with framed photographs, family pictures, vacation snapshots, remnants of a life that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. But there was an underlying tension here, something just beneath the surface, like the lingering scent of something long since rotted away. As they moved through the hallway, a staircase descended into darkness. A single overhead bulb flickered, casting erratic shadows along the narrow walls. And then, at the bottom of the stairs, they saw her. Amy Allan. She was sprawled across the cold cement floor of the basement, her body limp, her dark hair fanned out around her head. A length of black electrical cord lay nearby, partially coiled, its ends still looped as if hastily undone. Her skin was pale, lips slightly parted. Mercer crouched beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. No pulse, no warmth. Amy had been gone for some time. Collins surveyed the basement quickly, shelves lined with old boxes, a washer and dryer against one wall, a workbench cluttered with tools. The room was neat, but something about the scene felt staged. The cord, the position of her body, the absence of any sign of struggle. Mercer stood, his gaze flicking toward Jimmy, who lingered in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists. "When was the last time you saw her alive?" Mercer asked. Jimmy swallowed hard. I don't know. Maybe an hour ago? We had an argument, and she went downstairs. I thought she needed space. Then I came down and..." He gestured vaguely toward the body, his voice breaking. Collins exchanged a look with Mercer. The basement ceiling was low, the exposed beams rough and unfinished. She stepped closer to one of them, eyeing the black cord. If Amy had used it to take her own life, then where had she fallen from? More importantly, how had she managed to undo it afterward? A creeping unease settled into the room. Something wasn't right. Upstairs, the sound of sirens grew louder as more units arrived. The crime scene technicians would be here soon, along with the medical examiner. But already, Mercer had a feeling that this wasn't going to be the kind of case that ended with a simple explanation. This wasn't just a tragedy. This was something else entirely. The basement of 2435 Maple Street felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was the cement floor, the unfinished wooden beams overhead, or the way the dim light flickered against the exposed wiring along the walls. Officers Daniel Mercer and Jenna Collins stood near the body, their eyes scanning every detail. The crime scene technicians were working quietly, cameras clicking as they documented the space. It was a standard basement, storage bins stacked neatly against one wall, an old washing machine humming faintly in the corner, a workbench covered in tools that looked well used but suspiciously undisturbed. The air was still, stale, and thick with something that neither officer could quite define yet. Amy Allan's body lay motionless, her dark hair fanned out around her, skin pale and still. The electrical cord sat nearby, its length curling loosely across the floor. Mercer had seen enough cases to recognize when something didn't fit. If Amy had truly hanged herself, why was she on the ground, her body positioned almost too carefully? There was no overturned chair, no stool, nothing to suggest how she had reached the height necessary to tie the cord to the ceiling beams. The basement was low, barely high enough for an adult to stand without ducking. The wooden beams above them had no hooks, no visible signs of tension. Something about it felt unnatural, as if the scene had been arranged rather than discovered. Jimmy Allan stood at the bottom of the staircase, just far enough away that he seemed reluctant to step any closer. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his jeans, his shoulders hunched, his expression difficult to read. Mercer had seen grief in all its forms: screaming, sobbing, anger, even numb silence. But Jimmy's reaction was different. He wasn't asking questions, wasn't demanding answers. He wasn't even looking at Amy. Instead, his gaze darted between the officers and the floor, his jaw tight as if he were bracing for something. Collins moved toward the ceiling beams, her eyes tracing the wood carefully. If a person had hanged themselves, there should have been some kind of anchor point, some evidence of weight being supported. But there was nothing. No knots, no abrasions in the wood, no remnants of the cord. She exchanged a glance with Mercer, and he could tell she was thinking the same thing. Something didn't add up. Mercer turned his attention back to Jimmy. "Can you show us exactly where you found her?" Jimmy hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. He gestured vaguely toward the center of the room. "She was right there," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Collins folded her arms. "And she was hanging from where exactly?" Jimmy's eyes flickered to the beams, then back to the officers. His fingers twitched at his sides. I don't know. From up there, I guess." Mercer's voice remained steady. "Did you cut her down?" Jimmy nodded quickly. "Yeah." "With what?" There was a pause before he said, "A knife." Mercer studied him for a moment. "Where is it now?" Jimmy's shoulders lifted in a shallow shrug. "I don't know. Maybe in the kitchen." Behind him, one of the crime scene technicians made a quiet note, jotting something down on a clipboard. Collins crouched beside the electrical cord, lifting one end carefully with a gloved hand. The frayed edges suggested it had been cut, but there was no real strain on the fibers. If Amy had been hanging from it, there should have been tension, some kind of pull that frayed the cord unevenly. But instead, it looked clean. She set it back down and looked at Mercer. "We should have forensics check this." Jimmy shifted uncomfortably. "I already told you. I cut her down. My prints are probably all over it." Collins didn't respond. She simply nodded, as if filing that information away for later. Outside, officers had begun canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors and speaking with anyone who might have seen or heard something. Most neighbors had nothing to add. This was a quiet area, the kind where people kept to themselves. But Linda Hayes, an older woman who lived next door, had noticed something. She told Officer Mark Grayson that she had heard arguing earlier that evening, muffled voices rising and falling through the thin walls. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but it had stood out because of how abruptly it had stopped. "Maybe around 7, she said, squinting as she tried to remember. 7:30 at the latest. It got real quiet after that." Grayson took notes. "Did you hear anything else after that?" Linda shook her head. "Number 2, but I'll tell you this. Things haven't been right over there for a while. I used to see Amy outside walking the dog, working in the yard. But lately, it's like she disappeared. And when I did hear her, she was crying." "Crying," Grayson repeated. "Not just crying," Linda clarified. "The kind of crying where you know someone's scared." Back inside the house, Mercer stood in the basement, letting the scene settle in his mind. He didn't like to make assumptions early in an investigation, but his instincts were telling him this wasn't what it seemed. The details weren't lining up. The neighbor's statement added another layer to it. If Amy had been afraid, what had she been afraid of? What had changed? He glanced at Jimmy again. His expression hadn't changed much, but Mercer noticed the small things: the clenching of his jaw, the way he kept shifting his weight, the way his fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to fidget. Mercer had seen grief before. It was messy, unpredictable. It came in waves, knocking people over when they least expected it. He had seen husbands collapse at the sight of their wives, seen mothers crumble at the loss of their children. And then there was this: the stillness, the restraint, the way Jimmy seemed more concerned about the officers than the woman who had just died in his home. He wasn't crying. He wasn't asking questions. He was just waiting. Mercer wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but he had a feeling that this wasn't just a suicide. This was something else entirely. The crime scene unit worked in steady silence, cameras flashing as they documented every inch of the basement. Technicians carefully bagged and labeled potential evidence, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fibers, noting anything that seemed out of place. The basement itself felt sterile, strangely impersonal, more like a storage space than a part of the home. There were no personal touches, no signs that anyone spent significant time down here. A single overhead light flickered faintly, casting distorted shadows against the cement walls. The air held a faint metallic scent, but there was no immediate sign of blood. Officer Daniel Mercer stood near the staircase, arms crossed, watching as the technicians moved with quiet efficiency. His mind was piecing together the inconsistencies, Amy's position, the electrical cord, the lack of an anchor point from which she could have hanged herself. Everything about the scene felt wrong. He had been to enough suicide calls to recognize when something didn't fit. Usually there were telltale signs: a chair knocked over, furniture disturbed, belongings scattered in a way that suggested impulsive desperation, but here it felt controlled, staged. Across the room, Jenna Collins ran a gloved hand along the wooden ceiling beams, looking for anything. A scrape, an indentation, a marking that would indicate something had been tied there. There was nothing. No sign of any attachment point, she murmured to Mercer. If she was hanging, what was holding her up? Mercer shook his head. That's the question, isn't it? Jimmy Allan remained near the doorway, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He was watching them work, but not in the way Mercer had seen grieving husbands watch before. There was no desperation, no helplessness, no anxiety about what they might find. If anything, it felt like he was waiting. For what, Mercer wasn't sure yet. The lead forensic technician, Mark Hollis, approached, a clipboard in hand. He was a man in his early 50s, with a no-nonsense attitude and an eye for detail. He had seen more crime scenes than he cared to count, and from the look on his face, Mercer could tell he wasn't convinced by what he was seeing. Preliminary assessment, Hollis said, his voice low. Lividity suggests she's been dead for at least an hour, maybe closer to 2. No obvious signs of trauma beyond the ligature mark on her neck, but we'll know more after the autopsy. He gestured toward the electrical cord. This is a problem, though. There's no sign that it was ever supporting a body. No stretching, no deep grooves. If she was hanging, it wasn't for long. Mercer absorbed that information. And if she wasn't hanging? Hollis exhaled slowly. Then we're looking at something else entirely. Mercer turned back toward Jimmy. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, glancing toward the stairs as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. You said you cut her down, Mercer said, his voice measured. Where exactly was the cord tied? Jimmy's mouth opened slightly before he spoke. Up there, he gestured toward the ceiling, but his voice lacked conviction. There's no sign of a tie point, Collins said evenly. Are you sure? Jimmy hesitated, his jaw tightening. I don't know. I wasn't thinking, okay? I just saw her and acted. Hollis raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence in the room spoke volumes. Upstairs, more officers were combing through the house, looking for anything that might shed light on the events leading up to Amy's death. Mercer had requested a full sweep. Anything that looked out of place, any signs of struggle, any evidence that might explain why Amy, a woman with no known history of severe depression, would suddenly take her own life in such a calculated manner. Collins stepped aside as a technician carefully bagged the electrical cord, sealing it as evidence. Her fingernails should tell us something, she said quietly to Mercer. If she was struggling, there might be defensive wounds. If there's DNA under them, then we'll know if someone was with her when she died, Mercer finished. Jimmy's head snapped up at that. His reaction was subtle, but Mercer caught it. The tightening of his shoulders, the quick intake of breath, the flicker of something in his eyes. Fear? Guilt? It was too soon to tell. A moment later, Officer Mark Grayson entered the basement, nodding briefly to Mercer before handing him a notepad. Spoke to the next-door neighbor, Grayson said. She heard them arguing earlier tonight. Says it got loud, then stopped suddenly. Mercer flipped through the notes. What time? Somewhere between 7 and 7:30. That was a problem. Jimmy had told them he last saw Amy alive about an hour ago, which would have been around 8:30. If the argument ended at 7:30 and Amy had already been dead for at least an hour when they arrived, then Jimmy's timeline wasn't adding up. Mercer looked up. Jimmy was staring at him now, tense, like a man realizing the walls were closing in. Jimmy, Mercer said carefully, when exactly did you find her? Jimmy blinked. I told you. I came down a little before I called 911. So just before 8:40? Yes. Mercer kept his expression neutral. And she was still warm when you touched her? There it was again, that brief flicker of hesitation, that fraction of a second where Jimmy's mind was calculating what to say next. I don't know, he finally muttered. I wasn't thinking about that. His voice broke off, and he ran a hand through his hair. Why are you asking me all this? She's dead, isn't that enough? Collins stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We're asking because things aren't lining up, Jimmy. Your timeline doesn't match up with the forensic evidence. Your neighbor says you two were fighting at 7:30, but you say you found her just before 8:40. That's over an hour. And the thing is, Amy had already been dead for a while by the time we got here. Jimmy's lips pressed into a thin line. You think I had something to do with this? We don't think anything yet, Mercer replied, but we do think we need answers. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of it pressing in from all sides. The forensic team continued their work, bagging evidence, taking samples, cataloging every possible clue. Outside, the flashing lights from the patrol cars painted the house in alternating shades of red and blue. Mercer had been doing this long enough to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that this case was about to get a lot more complicated, because Amy Allan hadn't just died. Something had happened to her, and someone in this house knew exactly what it was. Detective Daniel Mercer drove back toward 2435 Maple Street, his thoughts circling like vultures over fresh evidence. The autopsy report had changed everything, but in truth, it had only confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning. The body didn't lie. It told a clearer story than words ever could. Beside him in the passenger seat, Detective Jenna Collins was reviewing her notes, flipping back through the inconsistencies in Jimmy Allen's statements. His timeline was already falling apart, but now they had physical proof that Amy Allan had been restrained, had struggled, and had died before the so-called hanging had even taken place. An hour, Collins murmured, scanning the case file. Maybe more. Mercer nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. Jimmy had claimed he found Amy just before calling 911, but lividity and rigor mortis suggested otherwise. Amy had been dead long before he made that call, and yet he had stood there, telling them he had just found her, his voice shaking, his hands steady. The house was eerily still when they arrived, the crime scene tape stretching across the doorway like a silent warning. Inside, the forensic team had already finished their initial sweep, and the only sign of life was Officer Mark Grayson, who was standing in the kitchen reviewing his notes. He looked up as Mercer and Collins entered, nodding toward the counter. I found something interesting, Grayson said, motioning toward an open laptop resting on the wooden surface. This was Amy's. Collins pulled on a pair of gloves before touching the device. The screen was still open to her email inbox, the last few messages unread. Mercer stood beside her, scanning the subject lines. Legal consultation, apartment listings, bank statements. He exchanged a look with Collins. She was planning to leave, Collins murmured. The pieces were snapping together. Amy hadn't been preparing for an abrupt, reckless departure. She had been methodical. She had been organizing, making sure her finances were in place, ensuring she had somewhere to go. She had been planning her escape. Collins clicked on one of the emails. It was from a domestic violence outreach program, dated 3 weeks before her death. The subject line read, seeking advice on leaving a controlling spouse. Mercer exhaled slowly. Amy had known she was in danger. He turned to Grayson. Did Jimmy know about this? Grayson shook his head. Hard to say, but if he did, and if he realized she was actually going through with it, he let the thought hang in the air. but they all knew where it led. There was no greater threat to a man like Jimmy Allan than losing control. The idea of Amy leaving, walking away, taking her independence with her, might have been enough to set something off. Maybe it wasn't premeditated. Maybe it was a moment of rage, of fear. Maybe he had panicked. But Mercer had seen enough cases like this to know that when control was slipping, some men reacted with desperation. And desperation could be deadly. The evidence was stacking up, but it wasn't just about proving what had happened. It was about proving when it had happened. "We need his phone records," Mercer said. "We need to know exactly where he was, what he was doing in the hours before he called 911. Grayson nodded. "Already put in the request. Should have it soon." Mercer turned back to Amy's laptop, scrolling through her search history. There, among the mundane everyday queries, was one that stood out. How to file a restraining order against a spouse. Collins met his gaze. She wasn't just thinking about leaving, she said. She was getting ready to fight back. And that, Mercer thought, might have been what sealed her fate. The next morning, Mercer and Collins sat across from Detective Ryan Hathaway, a digital forensics specialist. The room was filled with monitors, each displaying snippets of data from various cases. Hathaway was a quiet man, meticulous, the kind of investigator who could sift through thousands of lines of information and find the single thread that mattered. "We pulled the records from Jimmy Allan's phone," Hathaway said, sliding a file across the table. "There's a gap in activity between 6:45 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. the night Amy died. No calls, no texts, no GPS pings." Mercer frowned. "That's a big window." Hathaway nodded. "He told you he was watching TV, right? Said he stayed upstairs the whole time?" "Yeah." Hathaway tapped the report. "Then explain why his phone was disconnected from the home Wi-Fi for exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes during that period." Collins narrowed her eyes. "Meaning?" "Meaning his phone wasn't in the house." There it was. The first crack. Mercer leaned forward, feeling the shift in the case. "So where was he?" "We don't know yet," Hathaway admitted. "But I can tell you this. His phone reconnected to Wi-Fi at 8:32 p.m., about 10 minutes before he called 911. Which meant Jimmy hadn't been inside the house for a large portion of the time he claimed to be upstairs, unaware of Amy's death. He had been somewhere else, doing something else, and then he had come back. "Get his GPS logs," Mercer said. "If he left the house, we need to know where he went." As Hathaway got to work, Mercer sat back, his mind running through the growing web of evidence. The falsified timeline, the lack of a credible cause of death, the control Jimmy had held over Amy slipping away, the unexplained window of time where he had left the house, only to return and make the 911 call. There was still more to uncover, but one thing was becoming clearer with every passing hour. Amy Allan's death was no accident, no mistake. This had been deliberate, and Jimmy Allan was running out of places to hide. The weight of the investigation pressed heavier with each passing hour. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, and every new discovery only reinforced the growing suspicion that Amy Allan's death was no accident. The forensic evidence, the gaps in Jimmy's timeline, and now the revelation that Amy had been preparing to leave. It all painted a picture of a woman standing at the edge of escape, only to be pulled back into something far darker. Detective Daniel Mercer had spent enough years on the force to know that cases like this followed a pattern. A woman trapped in a toxic relationship, a man who saw control slipping through his fingers, the breaking point. Then a desperate attempt to cover up what had been done. He had seen it before, and he knew how it ended. One person gone, the other left standing over the wreckage, rewriting the story. The problem with rewriting the story, though, was that evidence never changed. It didn't shift under pressure or twist itself to fit a better narrative. The truth was buried in the bruises, the DNA, the timelines that no amount of explanation could smooth over. And that was exactly what Mercer and Detective Jenna Collins were focusing on now. In the sterile brightness of the forensics lab, Dr. Elliot Grayson laid out the final details of his autopsy report. The conclusion was undeniable. Amy had not died by suicide. The bruising around her neck was inconsistent with a hanging, but perfectly matched manual strangulation. The force required to create that damage meant one thing: someone else had been in that room with her. Beyond that, the fingerprint analysis on the electrical cord revealed something crucial. There were prints on the outer surface, where someone might have grabbed it to cut it or move it. But the interior of the loop, the part that had supposedly been used as a noose, had no trace of Amy's DNA, no skin cells, no natural oils that should have transferred if she had tied it around her own neck. Mercer leaned over the report, running his finger along the printed words. "So she never touched it?" Grayson shook his head. "Not in the way you'd expect if she had done this to herself." Collins exhaled, tapping her pen against the edge of the table. "That means someone else placed it around her neck, after she was already gone." Mercer nodded. They had suspected it before, but now they had irrefutable proof. The hanging had been staged. Amy had been killed first. There was more. The skin found beneath Amy's fingernails had returned a partial DNA match. Not enough to confirm identity with absolute certainty yet, but enough to confirm that she had struggled against someone. The presence of defensive wounds on her arms indicated she had tried to fight back, that this hadn't been a sudden or uncontested event. The scratches, the bruising, the fragmented skin cells, everything suggested a struggle before her body had been moved. The evidence was mounting, but now Mercer needed a motive that could tie everything together. He knew Amy had been planning to leave, but had Jimmy known? Had he discovered her plans before that night, or had an argument escalated beyond control? The breakthrough came from her financial records. For weeks leading up to her death, Amy had been withdrawing small amounts of money from their shared account, never enough to raise suspicion, but collectively adding up to nearly $5,000. She had opened a separate bank account, listing only her name. Something Mercer knew from experience was a classic sign of someone preparing to leave an abusive relationship. If Jimmy had found out about the money, about the apartment listings, about the restraining order she had been researching, the pieces fell into place. And then there was Jimmy's phone data. The forensic techs had finally cracked his location tracking. Despite claiming he had been home all evening before discovering Amy's body, his phone had been disconnected from Wi-Fi for over an hour, and GPS data showed movement during that time. The signal had bounced off a nearby cell tower, placing him a few miles from the house, though the exact destination was unclear. The implications were obvious. Jimmy had left. But why? Mercer stared at the screen displaying the mapped movements. If Jimmy had gone somewhere before coming back and making that 911 call, where had he gone? More importantly, what had he done in that missing hour? Collins, flipping through the bank records, suddenly straightened. "We need to check security footage from her bank." Mercer turned to her, catching the sharp edge in her tone. "Why?" "Because the last ATM withdrawal from Amy's account happened the afternoon before she died." Collins tapped the paper. $200. But it wasn't made near her job. It was taken out from a machine near Jimmy's garage. Silence stretched between them. If Amy had been withdrawing small amounts to save money, why would she have used an ATM near Jimmy's workplace, a place she rarely had reason to visit? Unless— Mercer's stomach tightened. Unless she wasn't the one who made the withdrawal. If Jimmy had accessed her account, whether by force or deception, it meant he had already been watching her movements closely. Maybe he hadn't known everything. Maybe he hadn't yet found the emails, the searches, the apartment listings. But if he had caught wind of something, if he had suspected she was planning something, Mercer felt the shift in the case like a weight settling over his shoulders. Amy hadn't just been trying to leave. Jimmy had known, and he had done something to stop her. Detective Daniel Mercer stood in the dimly lit briefing room, staring at the whiteboard covered in photos, notes, and the growing web of evidence tying Jimmy Allan to his wife's death. It was no longer a matter of if he was involved, but rather how much he had planned and how deliberately he had executed his cover-up. The autopsy had confirmed Amy did not die by hanging. The forensic analysis had revealed she had been strangled first, with bruising on her arms indicating she had been forcibly restrained. The ligature mark on her neck was inconsistent with a self-inflicted hanging, and most damning of all, the electrical cord used as a makeshift noose had no trace of Amy's DNA inside the loop. She had never tied it around herself. The scene had been staged. The bank records told another story. Withdrawals Amy had supposedly made near Jimmy's workplace in the days leading up to her death, even though her search history showed she had been trying to move out. If she had been planning to leave, Why would she still be withdrawing money from an account Jimmy could track? Unless, of course, he was the one making those withdrawals, either to monitor her movements or to financially corner her before she could escape. And then there was his missing time. For over an hour and 15 minutes, Jimmy's phone had been disconnected from the home's Wi-Fi, meaning he was somewhere else before coming back and calling 911. The signal had placed him miles from the house, but exactly where he had gone was still uncertain. Mercer knew that if they could pinpoint his location, it might be the final piece that shattered his alibi. The breakthrough came from traffic cameras. A unit had pulled footage from an intersection near an ATM, the same one from which money had been withdrawn using Amy's card. The timestamp. Less than an hour before Jimmy made his 911 call. And there he was, Jimmy Allan's car. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. A man matching his build, his posture, his features, standing at the ATM, his face partially turned away. Mercer exhaled, feeling the final click of the case fall into place. The lie was fully unraveled now. If Jimmy had been making those withdrawals, if he had left the house when he claimed he was home, if Amy's body showed signs of struggle and an attempt to fight back, there was no question anymore. This had been a murder, staged to look like a suicide, by a man who had realized he was losing the one thing he couldn't afford to lose: control over Amy Allan. It was time to bring him in. The interrogation room was cold, sterile, designed to press on the nerves of the person sitting inside. Jimmy Allan sat in the metal chair, arms crossed, his face locked in an unreadable expression. He wasn't crying. He wasn't asking for updates. He wasn't acting like a man who had just lost his wife in a tragic accident. He was waiting. Detective Mercer entered the room, dropping a thick file onto the table. The sound echoed sharply, and Jimmy flinched, just slightly but enough for Mercer to notice. Collins stood by the door, silent, watching. "We've gone over the evidence, Jimmy," Mercer said, his tone calm, almost conversational. "We know Amy didn't hang herself." Jimmy didn't move. "We know she was strangled first," Mercer continued. "We know she fought back." A muscle twitched in Jimmy's jaw. "We know you weren't home when you said you were." That did it. Jimmy's fingers clenched against his arm, his first real physical reaction since they brought him in. He wasn't prepared for that detail. Mercer leaned forward. "You want to tell us where you really were, or do you want us to let the jury figure it out?" Silence stretched between them. Jimmy didn't deny anything. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. And that silence told Mercer everything he needed to know. The grand jury indictment came swiftly. The prosecutors had built an airtight case, a timeline supported by forensic evidence, digital tracking, and witness statements. The evidence was damning, a motive fueled by control, a staged crime scene meant to mislead, and a suspect who had been caught in his own web of lies. When the arrest warrant was issued, Mercer and Collins arrived at Jimmy's workplace, flanked by uniformed officers. He was in the middle of a conversation with a co-worker when he saw them, his face going pale, his body tensing just for a second before he forced himself to remain still. Mercer didn't give him the satisfaction of a dramatic moment. He simply walked up, cuffs in hand, and said the words that marked the beginning of Jimmy Allan's downfall. "James Allan, you're under arrest for the murder of Amy Allan." There was no struggle, no outburst. Jimmy turned, let them cuff his wrists, and walked out in silence. But Mercer knew what that silence meant. It was the silence of a man who thought he could rewrite reality, until the evidence told a story he couldn't escape from. And Amy Allan's story had finally been heard. But it wasn't just science and data that built the case. It was Amy's own voice, preserved in the traces of her last weeks. Her emails, text messages, and internet searches told a story of a woman trying to reclaim her life, only to be trapped before she could escape. She had been searching for apartments. She had been looking into restraining orders. She had been secretly withdrawing money to leave. The jury saw the emails to domestic violence support groups, the quiet, desperate attempts to seek help without setting off alarms. Amy had been preparing to walk away, and Jimmy had known. He had felt control slipping, and instead of letting her go, he had made sure she never left that basement alive. The prosecution didn't need to prove motive, but they had it, and that motive was control. Jimmy's defense team fought back, but the cracks in their strategy were evident from the start. They attempted to paint Amy's actions as those of a deeply troubled woman, arguing that her financial withdrawals and apartment searches didn't indicate fear, but instability. They suggested that she had been emotionally overwhelmed, prone to impulsivity, and that Jimmy had been a loving husband blindsided by tragedy. But cross-examinations dismantled their claims one by one. Amy's best friend testified that Amy had confided in her, revealing she was afraid to leave, that she had been waiting for the right moment. Her coworker described how Amy had been in the process of securing her own place, that she had spoken about starting over. A financial analyst walked the jury through her banking records, showing that her withdrawals had been intentional, structured, not erratic or reckless, but calculated steps toward independence. The evidence wasn't just factual, it was deeply human. Amy wasn't unstable. Amy was trying to survive. The turning point came when the prosecution played the 911 call. Jimmy's voice, shaking but strangely devoid of real distress, filled the courtroom. The timeline no longer matched. The science no longer aligned. The reality was undeniable. Jimmy had already known Amy was dead when he made that call. The jury watched as the prosecution laid out the final sequence of events. Amy had likely confronted Jimmy that night, perhaps revealing her intent to leave. An argument had turned into violence. She had fought back, clawing at him, leaving traces of DNA under her nails. He had strangled her, then staged the scene, using an electrical cord to make it look like suicide. He had left, possibly to create an alibi, then returned and called 911. The courtroom was silent when Rachel Whitmore delivered her closing argument. She didn't use grand gestures. She didn't need theatrics. She simply held up a photo of Amy, looking directly at the jury. "This is Amy Allan," she said. "She had a life. She had a future. She had hope, and she tried to take that future back. But she never got the chance, because the man who was supposed to love her refused to let her go." The verdict came after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty. Jimmy Allan sat still as the words were read, his face unreadable. But there was no shock, no outburst, no protests of innocence. Just silence. The sentence was swift. 20 to 45 years in prison, a ruling that ensured he would spend decades behind bars, unable to manipulate, control, or harm anyone ever again. For Amy's friends, her family, and those who had fought for her story to be heard, it was not justice in its purest form, because justice would have been Amy walking away alive. But it was accountability, and sometimes that was the closest thing the legal system could offer. The courtroom had emptied, but the weight of what had happened inside lingered like a heavy fog. The words had been spoken, guilty, and with them, a sense of finality settled over everyone who had fought for this moment. There was no celebration, no sigh of relief that could undo what had been done. Justice in its legal form had been delivered, but it would never be enough to fill the space that Amy Allan had left behind. Her family sat in silence, absorbing the reality of what had unfolded. The trial had been long, brutal in its revelations, forcing them to relive the moments leading up to Amy's final hours. They had heard the autopsy details laid out clinically, had watched the grainy surveillance footage that placed Jimmy exactly where he swore he hadn't been, had listened to the desperate 911 call that now rang hollow with the knowledge that Amy had already been dead long before it was made. Every piece of evidence had been a reminder that this was not an accident, not a moment of impulse, but a calculated act of control and finality. Jimmy Allan showed no emotion as the judge handed down his sentence, 20 to 45 years in prison. He did not react, did not beg, did not break down in the way some men did when faced with the consequences of their own actions. He simply stood, his hands cuffed in front of him, his expression unreadable. But Mercer saw something in the way his jaw tensed, the way his shoulders stiffened as if bracing for impact. This was a man who had lost, not just his freedom, but the power he had spent years wielding over Amy. He was led away in silence, disappearing through the courtroom doors, swallowed by the system that would now dictate every aspect of his existence. He had once controlled Amy's world, dictated her choices, kept her within the confines of his rules. Now he would wake up every day behind bars, answering to the authority of guards, locked away from the life he had tried so hard to manipulate. For Amy's loved ones, it was justice in the only form the law could offer. But no sentence, no number of years in prison could undo the reality that Amy should have been here, alive, free, living the future she had fought so hard to reclaim. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, the late afternoon sky streaked with the deep oranges and purples of an approaching sunset. News crews lingered by the steps, cameras aimed, reporters waiting to gather reactions. The case had gripped not just Tecumseh, but beyond. Another woman taken too soon, another name added to the growing list of those who had tried to leave and never made it out. The conversations in the community had changed in the months leading up to the trial. Amy's story had forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. How had no one seen the warning signs? Had there been moments where someone could have intervened? Had Amy's quiet cries for help been overlooked? She had done everything she could. She had reached out, searched for answers, tried to make a plan. She had moved cautiously, trying not to set off alarms, trying to leave on her terms, in her time. But that wasn't how it worked for people like Jimmy Allan. Control was never relinquished easily. And when Amy finally tried to step beyond his reach, he had made sure she never walked away at all. Her death became more than just a tragedy. It became a wake-up call. People who had never met her began to talk about coercive control, about the patterns that weren't always visible until it was too late. Women who had dismissed the uneasy feeling in their stomachs, the small, controlling behaviors they had excused, now began to look at their own lives through a sharper lens. Community organizations saw a rise in calls, in people seeking help, in women taking the steps that Amy never got the chance to complete. Her story had saved others, but that did not make her loss easier to accept. Detective Mercer sat in his car outside the courthouse, watching as the last of the crowd dispersed. The case was over, at least on paper. His job was done, but Amy's face stayed with him. The one in her photos, before the fear, before the control had worn her down. She had been a woman with plans, with dreams, with a life that should have stretched far beyond the walls of that basement. He had seen too many cases like hers, had watched too many people sit across from him in interview rooms, struggling to explain the fear they lived with daily. It was never simple. It was never as easy as just walking away. It was a process, one that had to be handled carefully, cautiously, because the moment control started slipping was often the most dangerous moment of all. As he started his car, the radio crackled to life, another call coming in, another case unfolding. Life kept moving forward, but Amy's name would not be forgotten. Somewhere in another home, in another town, another woman was making the same plans, taking the same small steps toward freedom. Maybe this time, someone would recognize the signs. Maybe this time, someone would step in before it was too late. Maybe Amy's story would be the reason someone else got the ending she had been denied. And maybe, just maybe, that was the closest thing to justice that the world could offer.